Hi everyone, thanks for watching. I hope you're all well wherever you are and whatever you're up to. I'm Lauren, I'm the owner of Guthrie and Ganny, my fabric shop, which I am in right now and also online as well. And in this video, I want to share with you all of my hints and tips for cutting out your dressmaking projects. Now, when you come to make a garment, cutting out is a necessary step. Love it or hate it, it has to be done in order to get to the sewing part. And if you spend time getting it right and prepare everything properly, it can actually make quite a big difference to the construction process. It can make it much easier and more accurate, and it can also really affect overall how the garment hangs on your body as well, and how it washes and wears over time if it's been cut out properly in the first place. I have also made a blog post that goes along with this video, and I've sort of summarised all of the things I'm going to chat about in note form there too. So if you find it easier to kind of digest and read these things and look at some pictures as well, then I'll put the link to the blog post in the description to this video. So first of all, before you come to cut out anything, there are some preparation steps that you have to do. And the first thing is that it is best practice really to pre-wash and iron your fabric before you cut out. Now, how you pre-wash your fabric is going to depend on what fabric it is, and it might be that your fabric came with some suggested washing instructions, or it might be that you know how you wash all of your clothes and once they're actually made, and in which case it's best to pre-wash the fabric in the same way that you know you will treat the garment once it's actually made as well. If there is no washing instructions that came with your fabric when you purchased it and you're not really sure how to wash it or how to look after it, I do have a separate blog post that is about that as well, and it talks through some suggested ways that you might want to pre-wash and generally care for different types of fabrics. So again, I'll put a link to that in the description of this video as well. So once you have pre-washed and dried your fabric in the most appropriate way for it, then it's time to iron it before you cut out. And I would suggest that you don't underestimate this step, especially if your fabric is made from natural fibres or has got a natural fibre component to it. Ironing it and pressing it and steaming it really well before you cut out can make quite a big difference to the fabric. So if your fabric is a synthetic fabric, it's made from polyester, or it has synthetic fibres in it, maybe it's a mix, it's likely that it won't need quite as much ironing, or it might not need ironing at all. But if it does have natural fibres, so cotton, modal, tencel, rayon, viscose, linen, ramie, any of those types of bases are really going to benefit from having a good press before you come to cut out. So my top tips for ironing and pressing the fabric after it's been pre-washed and before you come to cut it out is to make sure that you have got water in your iron so that it can generate steam, and make sure that the steam function is turned on in your iron, however you do that. And then it's at the most appropriate temperature for your fabric as well. So it might be that you've got little guides or like a sort of temperature gauge on your iron. What I would always suggest is that you just test a little bit on the side of your fabric before you go straight in and iron it all. But what you're aiming for really is that it's at the highest temperature that the fabric can tolerate. If it is made of natural fibres, it should be able to fairly withstand, quite a high heat. Make sure that your ironing board does have a nice bit of padding on it as well. That will make a difference. If the cover on your ironing board is very thin and like the metal sort of bit, or like the sort of base, the firm base of your ironing board is, there's not much between that and like the cover that's on the top, that can also affect how the finish on your fabric as well. So it's good if you can have like a little bit of kind of padding underneath there, or if you've got a really old ironing board cover, maybe it's time to look at getting a replacement. The other thing I would recommend is that you iron your fabric on the single layer. So don't be tempted to fold it in half with the selvages together and fold a crease in it. It's much more accurate if you iron it completely flat on the single layer. Depending on the fabric itself, you might have to take it quite slow and go over the same spot several times, especially if you don't have a particularly powerful iron in terms of heat and steam. So on the ramie fabric that we sell, for example, which is very similar to linen, you do need quite a high heat and you do need quite a lot of steam to press that fabric, and you do have to go over the same spot several times. And when you do that, you will really start to notice the difference in the fabric. Typically it will go flatter, of course, because you're ironing it. The steam will help to relax the fibers, and it can make the fabric much softer and feel thinner and more pliable. That can also be the case for some viscose fabrics as well. Sometimes it can almost feel like they go a little bit crispy, or they sort of like contract and come together quite a bit when you wash them and dry them. And then once you actually iron them and steam them, it's like they all just sort of relax and they go very sort of fluid and floppy again. And you want the fabric to be in that state when you cut it out, because that's how you want it to be when the fabric is made, when the garment is actually made up. I would also suggest that you iron your fabric pretty much right before you're about to cut it out. I mean, if you weren't going to be using the fabric right away and you ironed it and then you sort of folded it up and put it in a cupboard or on a shelf or whatever, and then took it out sometime later to cut it out, I would still suggest going over it again with an iron before you do then come to cut it out, so that it is really nice and smooth and flat, doesn't have any creases or bumps in it at all. So once your fabric is ironed and you are then ready to cut out, the next thing you need to prepare is your cutting surface. Now, I'm sure we can all picture our absolute dream cutting out surface area. A really nice big table that's nice and high so you don't have to bend over, and maybe it's got a self-healing mat on it or got some measuring things on it. You know, we can sort of dream of this table, but in reality it's probably likely that you're using a shared space in your house to cut out your fabric. So whether that is maybe a dining room table or maybe a kitchen island or just the floor somewhere in your house, it's, you know, you might have to improvise a little bit in terms of where you come to cut out. But my top tips would be, if you are using a shared space and you don't have a dedicated area for cutting out in your house, that the surface is nice and smooth and flat. So it's best, if you are cutting out on a floor, that the finish on the floor is not carpeted or it's not on a rug. It's better if it's like a smoother, flatter surface. So whether that's like laminate floor or wooden floor or tiled floor or whatever. I just generally find that when the surface is very nice and smooth and flat, that there is less friction between the fabric and the surface, and you can therefore have more control over it. If there's quite a lot of friction between the surface and your fabric, it can sometimes sort of inadvertently stretch or just not really be in exactly the right sort of orientation, and it can affect you getting the fabric on the grain line when you cut out as well. So yeah, try to make the surface as smooth as you're able to in the sort of space that you have where you are able to cut out. Try and get as big an area as you can as well. Obviously, if you're making a dress or something and you're like working with meters and meters of fabric, it's probably unlikely that you're going to have a space quite as big as that. Maybe if it's on the floor, you might have enough space to lay all your fabric out. But usually what I find is that at home I cut out on my kitchen island, and I probably have about 1.5 meters of usable space that I can use. So quite often I have a length of fabric that is, you know, that I've got as part of my fabric that just won't fit on the surface area that I'm working on. Now, it's going to help if there is not a drag or sort of strain on the fabric that is on your surface by the fabric hanging over the edge. So say it's quite a floppy viscose fabric, for example, and you're working with it on the area you've got, and you've got a big length of fabric dangling off the table. The weight of that fabric dangling off the table is going to pull and distort the fabric you're trying to work on. So it might be that you have a chair or a stool or whatever that's near the table, that the fabric can rest on that so that it takes the weight of it. Or it might be that you have to sort of fold the fabric up a little bit at the edge of the space you're working on, just so that the fabric can really be nice and relaxed as you come to cut out. So the next thing that I want to address is the cutting layout plans that typically come with your sewing patterns. They can be a really good starting point for working out where to place the pieces or your pattern pieces on your fabric, but you don't always have to follow them exactly as per the layout that is in the instructions. And there's a few different reasons why you might not want to do that, or you might not need to do that. So it might be that you are working with a width of fabric that is different to the width that the cutting layout has been mapped out for in your instructions. So quite often sewing patterns will have a cutting layout for a narrower fabric, which is typically say like 45 inches, so maybe like sort of 115 centimetres. And then they've also got one for a wider fabric, so it might be anything between sort of 50 and 60 inches, or like 140 centimetres to 150 centimetres wide. So if you've got a fabric that is kind of sitting in between those two, or it's much narrower, then you're going to have to sort of just interpret your own cutting layout, or sort of change things around a little bit. Or it might be that the cutting layout that comes in your sewing pattern instructions is just the general cutting layout for all the sizes in the pattern, and if you're making, depending on what size you're making of the pattern, it might be that you're able to position and manipulate the pieces around in a different way so that you can just have more economical use of your fabric. Or it might be that your fabric has got a particular design or print or pattern or check or stripe that you want to incorporate into your garment and position in a certain way on your garment as well. And therefore you have to deviate from the cutting layout in order to do that. So when you do come to make your own cutting layout for your project, it might be that you're sort of like placing the pattern pieces out and kind of moving them around before you commit to actually cutting out. The key things that you need to remember and take account of are that pieces that are supposed to be on the fold are placed on a fold, and that any pieces that aren't on a fold, that you are measuring from the grain line marking on the pattern to the selvage of the fabric to make sure that that grain line marking is parallel to the selvage, and therefore you're cutting the fabric out on the straight grain. If your fabric has a non-directional print to it, or has no obvious top and bottom, so a bit like the print that is on my jumpsuit here, then it can be that you can sort of have your pattern pieces like opposite ends to each other, so you don't have to have the top of all the pattern pieces in the same direction. You can kind of have one way and one going the other way, rather than both of them going that way, if you see what I mean. And it can just help you to use the fabric a little bit more economically. Other thing you can do is, instead of folding your fabric directly in half with the selvages together and then having your fold opposite of that, is that you can create a fold in the fabric that is just wide enough for the pattern piece that you're cutting out. And it depending on what the pattern is and the design and the garment and the size you're making and the width of your fabric, then it might be that you can get your front and back bodice pieces side by side on the width of the fabric as well, which quite often can mean that you save a bit of fabric. It can also mean that if you're cutting something on the fold and you're just creating that fold wide enough for your pattern piece, that the space of fabric that you've got left after that is one whole piece of fabric, which is generally a bit more useful. The bigger the piece of a fabric, typically, the more useful it then becomes. So rather than folding something directly in the fabric directly in half with the selvages together and cutting something out in the fold and then having two bits of fabric left over, you would have just one larger, bigger bit of fabric. It might also be that your fabric has a border print on it, or a border design, so maybe some sort of embroidery detail or just a pattern, and in that situation you're cutting your pattern pieces out with the fold or the grain line on the pattern piece at 90 degrees to the selvage rather than parallel to it. And it'll either be that you're cutting out on the single layer in that case, and then if it's on the fold you're sort of flipping it over to cut the other side, or it might be that you're just creating a fold in the fabric that is at 90 degrees to the border design that is on your fabric. The other thing that you have to take account of when you're laying your pieces on and preparing to cut everything out is that you've got your fabric on what is called the straight grain. So in woven fabrics, we'll talk about them first. In woven fabrics, the straight grain is just referring to the orientation or the direction of the fibres that have woven the fabric in the first place. So when you look at the selvage of the fabric, you're going to have threads that run parallel to that. That is the warp, and you're going to have threads that run at 90 degrees to that. That is the weft. And when you cut your garments out, it is important that those threads running in those running in those directions are sort of square to each other, and that you're orientating your pattern pieces on that straight grain, which is achieved first by getting your fabric laying on the straight grain as well. So when you match your selvages together and you're folding your fabric in half, smoothing everything out, if you've got quite lightweight fabric like a viscose or a rayon or a tencel, you might feel like you've got more control over it if you pin your selvages together just so that they don't move relative to each other. And you're just smoothing everything out, and I usually like to sort of smooth my fabric parallel to the selvage and also at 90 degrees to it as well, just so that I know that it's nice and smooth and flat. Now when you look at what is either the cut edge or the torn edge, which will be when your piece of fabric has been cut from a bolt or a roll of fabric, or it might have been torn from that, you can't rely on that edge being on the straight grain. Obviously, when we cut fabric in the shop, we try to cut it as straight as we possibly can, but you would never rely on that cut edge in order to lay your pattern pieces out and orientate them correctly. The same when the fabric is torn. When you tear fabric, which is best done with lightweight fabric like cotton lawn or viscose or rayon, it does tear through the path of least resistance, which is in line with the weft thread. So it does generally tear quite straight. But what can sometimes happen is that as the tearing is getting done, the fabric can get stretched a little bit. So it might be that you find that that edge is just a little bit distorted. So again, you wouldn't go off that edge in terms of lining any of your pattern pieces up. If you're creating a fold in the fabric that is just wide enough for the pattern piece that you need, then before you start pinning your pattern piece on and actually then coming to cut it out, you need to measure from the selvage to the fold and make sure that that fold is parallel all the way down, so that you know that the fold that you've created in the fabric is on the straight grain. Now, if there's a pattern or a design or a check or a stripe or something on your fabric that you want to incorporate into your project, then you can also use that when you come to cut things out, and use that to help you get it on the straight grain of the fabric. So say it was a checked fabric and the check is actually woven into the fabric, then I always would suggest that you cut that type of project out on the single layer, so that it is easier to make sure that the check and the stripe and the sort of design of the fabric can always be parallel to the grain line and also be at 90 degrees to it as well. So sometimes I'll fold my pattern pieces so that I've got some guidelines that are at 90 degrees to the grain line, and then that helps me just to orientate the pattern piece on the stripe or on the check of the fabric. If you've got a specific like design or print, or maybe it's like a certain sort of floral design or like a motif or something on your fabric, and you want to sort of place that in a certain part of the garment, so maybe you want a certain part of it to be at the neckline, for example, then you can obviously just place the pattern piece on that part of the print or design, or it might be that you're creating a fold in the fabric so that you're centering that flower or design or whatever it is, so that it's on the center front of your garment. So you can kind of use that to aid you, really. You can use the design or the print on the fabric to aid you when you come to cut it out. Now, do bear in mind that when patterns are printed onto a fabric, obviously they aim to print them on the straight grain of the fabric, but it might not always be like 100% on the straight grain. It might be very slightly off. Now, if it's good quality fabric, it should be on the straight grain, or it should only be off a little bit, in which case, if it's quite a sort of dominant or very obvious print, I would suggest that you kind of favour that and use that to place your pattern pieces on, so that when you're actually wearing the garment, the print looks straight and it doesn't look like it's going off to one side, or it's like meant to be horizontal but it's not, or something. I would suggest going with the print. But if it happens to be a fabric where you think, crikey, this is just like really squinty and off, then it could be that maybe it's a seconds, or it's not the best quality fabric that you're working with, in which case, you know, if you do favour the print that is on the fabric, you're going to end up with a garment that just sort of hangs a little bit funny, or sort of just distorts out of shape a bit once you're actually wearing it as a garment. When you're working with knit fabrics, getting it on the straight grain is a little bit different from woven fabrics, because knit fabrics don't have that selvage in them like woven fabrics do. Knitted fabrics or jersey fabrics means the same thing, sort of use that term interchangeably, knitted or jersey. They're typically made as a big tube. So the machine that makes them makes a big tube of fabric. That tube of fabric is then cut to make a flat bit of fabric, which then either goes onto a bolt or a roll, and then you buy it like that. Sometimes what they'll do is put almost like a fabric hardener on where that cut edge has been, just to stabilize that cut edge so it's easier to process the fabric and to put it onto rolls or to put it onto bolts. Sometimes they don't, it just depends on the sort of thickness or the structure of the fabric, but you probably wouldn't want to like go off of that cut edge as precisely as you would on a woven fabric, the selvage on a woven fabric, because you just can't be 100% sure that when the fabric has been cut on the machine that it's been cut totally straight. I have had it before that stretched fabrics are sort of cut at a bit of an angle, and then they tend to sort of seem like they're warping and twisting a little bit more. If it's a totally plain fabric, what I always do is that when I create the fold in the fabric, I'll look really closely at the fold, and you'll be able to see the sort of structure of the stitches that have woven the fabric. And they typically look like very, very fine lines. And what you're aiming for is that those lines generally look parallel to the fold that you've created. Now, they are very small. It's not going to be like an exact thing, but you can generally tell if they're more or less running parallel, or if they're really squinty and just, you know, running off the fold that you've created in a big way, in which case you would have to reposition your fabric a little bit. Or if your knitted or jersey fabric has a pattern or a print on it or a stripe, then that can also be really beneficial to helping you fold the fabric and getting it on the straight grain as well. So if it's a fabric that does have a pattern on it, even if it's not like a linear pattern with columns or rows on it, even if it's just like a sort of general pattern, it might be when you step back from it a little bit, you can notice a pattern repeat in it. And then when you create a fold in the fabric, you want to just make sure that the fold is sort of at the same point and that pattern repeat all the way down, and just, you know, smooth all the fabric out, get it nice and flat, and then you'll know that you're more or less going to be on a nice straight grain. The risk is with jersey fabric is if you don't spend a bit of time trying to make sure that you're cutting it out in the straight grain, is that once you start wearing and washing the garment, it can distort out of shape. And you might have noticed this maybe with some ready to wear clothes that you've had, that you come to iron it and it's like it won't just lay flat on the ironing board to iron, or maybe the hem goes a bit uneven or twisted. And all of those things happen when you don't cut fabrics out on the straight grain. Okay, so finally, after all of those preparation stages and getting your fabric ready to be cut out, there are options of how you actually come to cut the fabric out. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is maybe what is seen as a more sort of traditional, or like, you know, maybe most common way to cut fabric out, and that is when you use pins to pin your pattern pieces onto the fabric, and then you use a pair of scissors to cut round your pattern piece. This is my personal preference. This is how I cut out all of my sewing projects, and I guess old habits die hard. I've always done it that way, and because I've made a lot of garments and I've made a lot of clothes, I guess I've just got really good at doing it that way, and I have my own little system and my own little way to do it, and it works very efficiently for me. But it might be if you're still quite new in your dressmaking journey and you're trying out different things, you might find that another way works better for you. Ultimately, what you want to end up with is fabric that is cut out very accurately to your pattern pieces with nice smooth edges, and that is cut on the straight grain. And how you achieve that will probably be different for everyone, but ultimately that's what you want. So whether you achieve that through pattern, through pinning and cutting with scissors, or with a rotary cutter, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, what's most important is that you got your fabric cut out as accurately as possible. So with the option of pinning the pattern pieces on and then cutting them out with scissors, you want to make sure that the scissors that you have got are exclusively used for cutting fabric, and you need to be quite strict on that because scissors will go blunt very quickly if you're using them on paper and other things as well. So try to make sure that you've got a pair of scissors just for fabric. I personally use the Prim micro serration shears, and they have little teeth on the blades of the fabric which help to grip the fabric as you're cutting. So they're also really good for cutting through lots of layers of fabric or through very thick or heavy fabric like denim, for example, because the little teeth sort of grip the fabric. So as you cut, it's like the teeth are kind of forcing the fabric into the blade, whereas if it's a smooth blade and it's not totally sharp, what can happen when you're cutting through lots of layers or very, very thick fabric is that the fabric just gets sort of pushed away from the blade a little bit. So that's my personal preference on the scissors. You also want to make sure that you have got decent, good quality dressmaking pins as well. The sharper the better. So if you've got a really old set of pins and they're all like random ones in different sizes and you're not even sure where they came from, or maybe you inherited them from somewhere, I would suggest treating yourself to some new pins, because having sharp pins can make the pinning process much easier, and it can also be kinder on your fabric as well. If you're pinning very lightweight fabric with dull, blunt, thick pins, it can cause little runs in the fabric or make holes in it. So yeah, good pins are an option. If you regularly sew with very fine, lightweight fabrics like rayon or viscose or silk, you can get very fine pins as well. So if you do have that, I would suggest kind of keeping them separate so that when you work with that type of fabric, you use your special fine pins, and then when you're working with other normal not normal, but if you're working with more sort of medium and to lighter weight fabrics or thicker fabrics, that you've got your set of pins for that as well. When it comes to cutting round the pattern pieces, don't be afraid to use the full length of your blade on your scissors and really open and close that blade. Don't just sort of make tiny little snips with the top of your scissor. It'll be much easier if you get nice smooth cuts with it. The other thing that I also do when I'm cutting out is that as I come to close the scissors, I don't close them 100%. I probably leave about half to 1 centimetre of the blade open at the very, very tip of the scissors, so that I'm still holding up a little bit of the fabric with the blade, and it makes getting in to cut the next bit of the fabric much easier, because you're kind of keeping a little bit of it lifted up with the blade of your scissor. As far as possible, the other thing that can make it easier to control when you're cutting out is so I'm right-handed, so this will be vice versa if you're left-handed. So I'm right-handed, so as I'm cutting, I will typically try to have the pattern that's pinned onto the fabric on my right hand side, and I'll have the bit of fabric that I'm cutting off and cutting away in my left hand. Now this is especially useful if you're cutting away quite a small, narrow section of fabric, because if you hold it with your left hand as you're cutting it with your right, you can put a little bit of tension on that fabric, and it gives you much more control over the fabric and where you're cutting, that you can get it really right on the edge or right on the line of the pattern piece. Okay, the next option for cutting out is using a rotary cutter and a self-healing mat. And if you're a fan of the Great British Sewing Bee, I'm sure you will have seen the contestants regularly use this method, where they have pattern weights and they put their fabric out, then they put their pattern pieces on top, they weigh the pattern pieces down with pattern weights, and then they use a rotary cutter to cut round it. So for this method, you need to have a little bit more of a specific set of tools and setup, which I guess is the same as scissors and pins, but you know, you do need to have certain types of equipment to do this. You need a self-healing mat, which is going to cover and protect the surface that you're working on. You're also going to need a surface that's quite firm and hard, so as in not a carpeted floor. You really need something that's firm, you know, like a table or a hard floor, so that when you're cutting with the rotary cutter, you've got a bit of force coming back, and you can actually cut through the fabric much easier then. You'll obviously need a rotary cutter as well, and you can get different diameters of them. So you can get a 45mm one, and then you can also get a 28mm one as well. There's lots of variety in rotary cutters. They're most commonly used, I would say, for quilting and patchwork. and you can get ones with special soft handles or different grips and different ways that the blade sort of gets locked, but essentially they all are going to do a similar job. I guess a bit like dressmaking scissors, you can get different lengths of blade and different handles and different angles and that sort of thing. It's quite similar for the rotary cutters as well. In terms of the pattern weights themselves, you can get specific things that are called pattern weights, and they come in various different forms and shapes. You can get fun ones that are sort of shaped like bobbins, or you know, there's lots of different ways that you can weigh your pattern down. You can even just use cans from your pantry, so maybe some tins of beans or whatever, some tuna cans, something heavy just to weigh it down. It might be just have other sort of heavy things around the house that you can use to weigh it down. But ultimately the whole point is that the paper pattern is weighed down with something to hold it in place while you cut around the edge with your rotary cutter. All of the same rules still apply when you come to use this method in terms of making sure that the fold is parallel to the selvage, that you're measuring from the grain line to the selvage, all of those sorts of things. You still have to do all of that. I personally find this method a little bit more sort of time consuming or cumbersome, or just a bit more faffy, only because I don't have a cutting mat that is really big, and usually the dressmaking projects that I'm cutting out are always bigger than the mat that I have, so it ends up being that you have quite a lot of shuffling around to do, because you get the mat under one bit but then you can't cut round the whole thing, and then you have to reposition the mat to cut it again. So I just personally find that method a bit sort of too faffy for me, but I know a lot of other people like it. And if you've got a very big dedicated cutting surface that you can just sort of leave set up as a cutting surface in your house, and you can have a really big mat on it, then it can be a useful quick way to cut out your projects. It could also be that you combine the rotary cutter and self-healing mat option with the scissors and pins option as well. So if you find it hard to cut around your pattern pieces accurately and get it right on the edge of the paper, or to get a nice smooth cut, maybe you've got quite a sort of rugged kind of jaggedy cut of fabric and it's not nice and smooth, you could potentially just pin the pattern pieces on, roughly cut round them with scissors, and then you've got a smaller piece to work with, which is maybe easier to move around your self-healing mat, and then just use a rotary cutter to sort of trim the pieces down so that they then become the same size as the pattern piece. So yeah, you could use a combination of both of those options as well. The other option that you could try as well is using carbon paper and a tracing wheel. So in this option, usually it's best if you have some kind of self-healing mat on the surface that you're working on again, so that it just protects the surface, and also that the surface is firm, so you're getting a bit of force coming back as you move over it with the tracing wheel. So you'd have that down first, then you'd have your fabric, then you would have a layer of the carbon paper with the carbon side facing down to the fabric. Then you'd have your paper pattern pieces on top of that. You'd have to weigh them down like you did for the rotary cutter methods, and then you use your tracing wheel to trace round your pattern pieces, and then the carbon paper then transfers that marking onto your fabric, and then you can take that off, and then you can see your marking on your fabric, and then you can cut round that. So again, a bit like the rotary cutter method, it might involve a little bit of sort of faffing and moving things around. Usually you can't get carbon paper sheets that are that big, so then it would mean you'd have to have quite a few of them, or you end up having to move around your carbon paper quite a lot. You might find this method useful for maybe putting certain markings onto the fabric. So for example, it might be that you maybe want to mark darts onto your fabric, so it might be that you've cut out your pattern already, but then you're using the carbon paper just to mark the dart on it, or any other markings that are on it as well. So that could be an option. Again, you could use it in combination. And then the final option, which I've noticed is becoming more and more popular recently, is using PDF patterns with projector files. So this is when you have a bit more of a special setup, and you've got a projector set up overhead that is projecting directly down onto your fabric, and what it does is you have to sort of set it up to scale, and then it just projects down the cutting layout of the project that you're making. So then you'd set your fabric up on that, and obviously make sure that the fold in the fabric was still on the straight grain and everything that we said before. And then because you can see the shape of the pattern pieces that you need to cut out projected down onto your table, you can then just cut around them or use a rotary cutter and a rotary mat. So I've never tried this method myself. I don't really have all of that gear and that sort of setup, but I will pop a link to a blog post that sort of describes it a little bit more, and it might just be something interesting to sort of look into. But I have noticed that more and more people are opting for that or sort of trying it out on Instagram. So who knows, maybe in a few years time we'll all be using PDF projector files to cut out our pattern pieces. So I hope you have found all of those tips useful when it comes to cutting out, and it helps you to get really good results on your dressmaking projects. If you haven't subscribed to my channel already, then just remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss out on the next video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!